Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for coming along to our presentation today. It's great to be here in person after a pretty mad couple of years. Ben and I are going to talk to you today about China's strategic targeting of the telecom sector. And what we'll do is we'll run through a couple of case studies, and then we'll talk about some key takeaways based on our findings. But before we jump into that, start with some intros. So I'm Will Bonner. I'm the APAC desk lead within PwC's Global Threat Intelligence team. I've been involved with threat intelligence for about 5 years now. I have experience working both APAC originating and Iranian originating threats. My focus mostly on infrastructure tracking and network analysis. Outside of TI, my main passions are sport and music. I'm a big Liverpool fan and self-confessed Beatles nerd. So on that note, pass over to Ben.
So, hey, I'm Ben. I'm a senior analyst within PwC Threat Intelligence. I've been working in TI since about 2020 officially, but for a few years before that as well. Most of my work focuses around Russia and China-based threat actors, and I spend a lot of time tearing down malware and investigating threat actor infrastructure. Outside of the TI space, I'm very big into the martial arts, particularly grappling stuff like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and so on. So first off, we'll just kind of take a broad view of the targeting of the telco sector by China. This isn't a new topic. China's been targeting telecoms for, I would say, longer than either of us have been doing TI. And we see that there's actually quite a variety of different threat actors based in China that target the telecom sector. Now, one of the kind of particular crossovers we've noticed is that telecoms targeting actors also tend to align with the kind of 5 poisons targeting. So things like Chinese diaspora, things like the Uyghur community, so on and so forth. So to give a couple of more concrete examples, one of the kind of specialized implants used by an APT41 aligned actor was called Message Tap that came out a few years ago. This targets SMSCs, SMS centers, which are essentially a core part of the infrastructure used to send text messages. What this implant will basically let you do is go in and actually collect message data from IMEIs, basically devices of interest associated with your targets. We also do internet-wide scanning for a few different China-based APT malware families, your WinTs, your ShadowPads, Diruspi, and so on. And what we see from our data is that the telecom sector makes up by far the majority of victims.
Yeah, so to put that into some perspective for you, based on our own research and incident response engagements, we've identified the compromise of telecommunications providers in 28 countries. And although there is a bit of a red cluster around China's nearest neighbours, it is further wider spread than that. And it just goes to show the broad kind of targeting from these threat actors that we've observed. So I guess the next question is, why target telecommunications providers? Why are threat actors motivated to do this? I guess the quick, easy answer to that is we all use them. We all rely on telcos, and therefore it's highly likely that the targets of these threat actors are also using them. And you know, the data that these telcos store is really of high intelligence value to an espionage-motivated threat actor. They are a treasure trove to them. And when we consider the types of data that they store, it could include but not limited to telecoms metadata, subscriber data, and also core routing as well.
Yeah, to really kind of reinforce that, we could ask anybody who has a phone in their pocket to put their hands up, but we all know everybody here would, right? So, yeah, essentially all of these different accesses that you can get by compromising a telco kind of really create this exceptional value. You can, for instance, capture call detail records to find out who your targets have been talking to. You could, for instance, look at cell tower association data to physically track individuals. So what we kind of get from this, and this is one of our core messages, is that this downstream targeting means that securing the telecoms environment isn't just about protecting the organization, protecting the corporate network. It actually boils down to protecting the safety of your customers and the trust that they have placed in you.
Okay, so into the meat of the presentation, really, and starting with a threat actor which we call RedDev4. You might know them better from open source as Gallium, which is the Microsoft alias. Just a quick note on our kind of naming conventions for threat actors. We usually pair a color based on the origin country with a mythological creature, as is the case with Red Mention, which Ben will talk about later. But we stick with a dev set when we aren't 100% sure there isn't overlap with other groups. And that's the case for RedDev4, which is why they are a dev set. So up until a very recent Unit 42 blog, I think it was out a couple of weeks ago on Gallium, the most significant kind of open source reporting on the group was in December 2019 by Microsoft. And based on this report and our own analysis, we've kind of summarized the operations of the threat actor in a diamond model. So going through that now, if we look at the infrastructure that we know that they used in the past, most of it was hosted in Hong Kong, China, and Taiwan. They were using dynamic DNS domains. Victim-wise, we predominantly saw global telecoms, of course, but also global government entities. Capability-wise, we know that they use off-the-shelf tools like Mimikatz, but also lots of malware which we tend to associate more with China-based threat actors. So things like China Chopper, Ghost Rat, Poison Ivy, and also their own custom tool, which Microsoft named Black Mold. And this is essentially an adaptation of China Chopper, ostensibly used to target Microsoft IIS servers. Away from the kind of malware side of things, we're also aware that they use something called SoftEther VPN in their operations. Now, this is a free and open source VPN software. I think it was developed by a student in a Japanese university. And really, they're using this for both offensive purposes and also infrastructure management. And we're also aware of other China-based threat actors using this same VPN software. So the obligatory Mortigo chart wouldn't be a TI presentation without one. And really, this is just to highlight the initial pivots that we did, starting with the domain initial.com, which we became aware of earlier this year. And yeah, I'll be mentioning this domain quite a lot throughout this presentation, along with some of the associated subdomains as well. So moving on to some of the kind of more interesting findings that we observed. The subdomain v2.initial.com we saw was linked to a file that had been uploaded to VirusTotal, which is called softethervpn.zip. So straight away, we've got a nice link to softether. And within this zip file, we saw configuration files and server logs. Now, starting with the configuration file, within there we saw the hard-coded hostname v2.initial.com, which is great. And then we also saw something called a hub name. And we've redacted a string which we believe has links to an African-based telecommunications provider. Now, the hub name itself refers to something called a virtual hub, which is something within softether VPN software, which is essentially a component that allows you to connect remotely into another network. And that's also mentioned in the server logs, along with something called a cascade connection. Now, a cascade connection allows the user, it basically acts as a bridge from a softether VPN server into a remote virtual hub, and allows the user to move laterally through that network as if they are on the same local area network. And therefore, based on this, we assess with medium confidence that Red Dev 4 are using this method for some of the post-compromise activities once they've compromised the victim to maintain persistence within a victim network and move laterally throughout the network. In a similar vein, really, another initial.com domain, this time t1.initial.com. We observed a RAR file that had been submitted to VT, and this file had, the name of it has links with a Southeast Asian telecommunications provider. So already, without even looking at network traffic, we've seen links to both soft ether and to telecommunications providers as well. Now, within this RAR file is a 64-bit executable, and really this is the thing that triggered our malware analysis associated with Red Dev 4, which we'll get onto now. So, as well as the hash that's present within that RAR file, we also identified several more that were associated with known Red Dev 4 infrastructure, and even one that was linked to a domain outside of that initial.com cluster of domains. And these are all part of the same malware family. So the first thing we found was that once installed, dropped on a victim network, they will all create and start a service called IPH1P SVC, and the display name IP helper with the L replaced with a 1. And this is masquerading as a legitimate Windows service called, funnily enough, IP helper. And even if it wasn't kind of masquerading as that, we know that it is because of the description within that code snippet, which is basically lifted from online documentation to do with the legitimate IP helper service. And that's actually a pretty unique service name and enables you to go and pivot and find further malware samples. So we did that, and we found some other variants of this malware. So of the samples that we identified, and basing this on the compilation timestamps, it seems that the evolution of the malware has gone from using HTTPS for the C2 communication protocol to ICMP, and then more recently, raw TCP. So this is the thing that makes them variants. It's the C2 communications protocol. Oh, we're back. Cool. Yeah, but although they are variants, again, there is another commonality here. As well as the service name from the previous slide, the actual crafted C2 string sent from the victim to the C2 is the same for all three of these. So it's the word project in caps, followed by the payload file name, the computer name, and the victim IP address in hex. So once the C2 communication channel is established, the actor can issue commands via command parameters to perform certain operations on the victim machine. So to summarize the operations that they can perform, really it's general file management, so uploading, downloading, deleting files, that kind of thing, enumerating local drives on the victim network, and also initiating a shell session. And the command parameters themselves are hard-coded as Z0, Z1, and Z2. So we did a bit of research in open source, and there's some screenshots of Mandiant and CrowdStrike reporting on China Chopper, and there is overlap in those actual command parameters that have been hard-coded within those binaries. And there's also crossover with the functionality. And actually, when we think about the functionality of black mold, there's also overlap there as well, which we know to be an adapted version of China Chopper. So bearing all of this in mind, we assess with medium confidence that this malware is actually also an adapted version of China Chopper, where it's essentially being ported to C++ version. So now moving on to the infrastructure. One of the first things we noticed when querying within online port scanner data, many of the IP addresses responded with the banner soft ether VPN server, which was helpful. But if that wasn't the case, then we found that the ports 443, 992, and 5555 were open, and these are the default ports that soft ether VPN listens on. So if you're not seeing something obvious, then and those ports are open, then there's a chance that they are soft ether VPN servers. We also looked at a timeline of IP addresses that hosted initial.com parent domains or subdomains. And we found that previously, as had been reported by Microsoft, they were hosted in Taiwan and Hong Kong. However, since about October 2021, there was a shift to the Ghost ASN, and they weren't hosted in Hong Kong and Taiwan, which is kind of interesting when you look at that date and compare it to the date of the compilation stamp on the ICMP variant. So it potentially represents a complete shift in TTPs, especially in the case of the variant, because it could be an example of the threat actor looking to implement more discrete C2 communications and improving the tool, along with shifting to a different ASN and the location within which the infrastructure sits. What may have provoked them into doing that, I'm unsure, but it's certainly like an interesting alignment to have observed. So within NetFlow, we noticed that there were some IP addresses which were making regular connections to these known soft ether VPN servers on UDP port 40,000. Now, it transpires that this port number sits within a port number range that's reserved for something called UDP acceleration within soft ether VPN software. So these are connections basically between soft ether clients and servers. So we thought, okay, well, maybe these are soft ether clients that the threat actor is using, but we couldn't be sure. Then we realized that they were all sharing the same X509 certificate, which, I mean, looks pretty suspect on its own, but there was still a bit more digging to do. So this certificate has been associated with nearly 700 IP addresses. And of the active IP addresses that we queried for, we noticed that in network traffic, it appeared that they were doing classic reconnaissance, along with personal browsing and maybe some exploitation as well, although difficult to say from just NetFlow traffic alone. But essentially, we saw multiple connections to internet-facing servers belonging to global governments, universities, and of course, telecoms providers. So one thing to quickly say about some of this certificate has since expired. Since the Unit 42 blog on Gallium went out a couple of weeks ago, I think it was on a Monday, on the Friday, a new certificate was created, which may have been quite hard for us to find. However, it shares that there's a crossover of 75 IP addresses with this certificate. So to be honest, it was quite easy to find. But going back to this one for a second, when we first identified it, we thought we'd seen it before. But it's because we'd seen one very similar. And this one, with the same subject and issuer data, is associated with 6 IP addresses. And all of them are associated with known RedDev4 domains. So, for example, one of the IP addresses which served this certificate previously hosted 2 initial.com subdomains. There's also the presence, you might have noticed, of serial number being 0 in both of these, and it's also the case in the latest one. We're not 100% sure on this, but we think this might be a quirk of soft ether again, only because we've seen certificates associated with soft ether VPN servers associated with other threat actors that have the same value for the serial number, rather than it being a red dev 4 thing. But it's definitely something to keep in mind when you're hunting for this sort of stuff. So with everything that we've kind of observed, whether it was the soft ether file that we found on VT or the network traffic that we've observed, this is essentially a hypothesis of how the actor operations may look, where the threat actor connects into their client nodes, which are used for reconnaissance, exploitation, personal browsing, that kind of thing, as well as connecting to their soft ether servers. But then also, obviously, the connection between the victim networks and the soft ether servers, or the infrastructure that's also used for C2 servers. So either connections from the virtual hub to the soft ether VPN servers, using those cascade connections, or the actual C2 communications channel, using the adapted China Chopper malware that we discussed earlier. So onto victimology and the suspected compromised victims that we've observed in NetFlow. Basically, again, it's not really limited to a particular part of the world. I should say that this is a mixture of, it's predominantly telecoms, but it is a mixture of telecoms and government victims. And it also includes some victims of black mold that we scanned for at the start of last year. But although it's quite widespread targeting, it doesn't mean it's opportunistic. We think this is really very targeted activity, and it kind of mirrors the geopolitical landscape. And to kind of go deeper into that, really, as we started to see new victims pop up, we created a timeline of any significant world events concerning China and the victims we were seeing. And the difference in time between the event and the victim behavior always seemed to be, within a month either side, so it was very close. But for example, Argentina joining China's Belt and Road Initiative in February. Roughly a month later, we saw multiple Argentina-based telecommunications providers eliciting victim-like behavior. So we started to think, can we start to forecast this activity and think about who comes next? And it led us to create a new forecasting product, which essentially used kind of geopolitical events that were happening and thought about how targeting shifts might occur based on these geopolitical events. So an example of that is with the Argentina stuff. We thought, well, within Latin America, who might be like the next country to be targeted? And we knew Colombia weren't a member of the Belt and Road Initiative, still aren't, but they also had a presidential election coming up at the end of May. So we thought, well, they seem like, they could be a likely target for these guys. And lo and behold, towards the end of May, we noticed a Colombian telecommunications provider, again, eliciting victim-like behavior. So I guess really the point I'm trying to make here is that away from the sort of technical analysis, we have to remember that these guys are human, and there's motivations behind this targeting. It's strategic, and actually we can forecast some of this stuff based on what we're seeing in geopolitics and major world events. So I think it's something worth bearing in mind when it comes to thinking about likely targets for certainly Red Dev 4. Okay, on to Red Mention.
All right, so Red Mention, you might have heard of these guys under a few other names recently. One of them is Decisive Architect, which CrowdStrike blogged on them as. So we first encountered these guys in around about mid-2021 in some threat hunting engagements at a telecoms organization. We assessed that they're a China-based threat actor, and from our visibility, they primarily target telecoms orgs, but we've also seen them go after some government entities, a couple of universities, and some orgs in the logistics sector. From a targeting standpoint, they mostly look at kind of Chinese near neighbors, but we've also seen them in the Middle East and as far afield as the USA. In terms of tooling, I've highlighted BPF door here. This is a passive Linux-based backdoor that essentially provides them a way to sit quietly on victim systems and come back to them and get a root shell using particularly marked traffic. However, they've used some other stuff as well. I've mentioned regeorge, which is a type of web shell that's used for traffic tunneling. There's Mangzamel, which is a primary implant in the Windows environment, and they've also used some kind of custom and off-the-shelf tools. In particular, we've seen them use Metasploit potentially for both exploitation and for C2 purposes. So let's talk a bit about BPF door. So generally speaking, they will drop it as a binary under somewhere in /etc and modify an init script to add a line like you see here. What this line will essentially do is check whether the file /etc/systemfig/rpcbind.conf exists and execute it if it does. Once this process is running, it'll copy itself to the shared memory device, execute the copy with a command line argument, and exit. The new copy will do some lock file stuff, which essentially is just used to make sure only a single instance runs. It'll then rename itself to one of a list of benign-looking process names. More recently, though, we've seen it use only a single name. For example, they would drop a binary called net manager and rename the process to network manager to masquerade as a single particular system utility. Finally, the new process will delete the copy. So what you end up with here is a process with a seemingly benign-looking name that's a child of init. So if you look in, for instance, PS or top or so on and so forth, it's not going to look particularly obvious. At this point, things start getting interesting. BPF door will open up a raw socket, bind a filter to it to look for marked packets, and just sit quietly and wait for them. Red mention then comes along using a controller binary to generate this marker packet, and BPF door will give them back one of a few different types of interactive root shell over usually an encrypted channel. So to zoom in a bit on this network layer, BPF door opens up a raw or AF packet socket, which both of these essentially provide low-level access to network traffic. And it'll attach a filter, which looks for marked traffic. So for UDP and ICMP traffic, it's looking for payloads beginning 7255. And for TCP, it looks for packets beginning 5293. But in a few more recent versions, there's actually another slightly more complex marker that I thought was quite interesting. It's looking for 39393939, or for those of you who are sad enough to know their ASCII tables, 9999 as text. So when this one's seen, it'll actually look for a hex-encoded activation packet after 2 new lines. So what this is actually used for is to masquerade the activation requests as HTTP hosts. So we had some application logs from a victim, and what we could see is that before about August of 2021, they used this type of request here, a post for lots of A's followed by 9999. This is obviously kind of a little bit unusual. They also didn't include a user agent header, so it was a very kind of bare bones request by the looks of it. However, after August, they switched to something like this, where they used a seemingly legitimate looking file name, well, one of a set of seemingly legitimate file names. But what you can see, and what I've highlighted in yellow, is that at the same offset, there's still 9999. Now, an interesting little fact about all these requests is they all use this same Chrome 90 user agent. By August 2020, by the way, 2021, by the way, Chrome 90 was out of date. So It's a little bit unusual. So once they've got an activation packet, now what? The packet will contain a password, and that password will be verified either by a simple string comparison or by checking a salted MD5. If the password begins with S, like socket, you'll get a reverse shell. It's fairly straightforward. It will connect back to a specified IP and port and exchange the shell traffic over an encrypted channel. This will either be based on the RC4 of the key of the password provided, or using TLS in a couple of rarer samples that we've seen on IRs. I don't think any of the samples using TLS have actually made it to online scanners or anything like that. The second shell type, which I think is actually a lot more interesting, is what I call a redirected bind shell. You get this when the password begins with J. Some of you might have heard of the password just for fun, which was also used as a name for BPF-DOR by CrowdStrike. So here it will actually bind a high port, I think it's in around the 40,000s, and create a couple of IP tables rules. What these rules will do is forward traffic from the C2 controller going to an arbitrary port to this high port. So what do you actually get from this? You can instruct it to say, redirect traffic on port 80 or port 443, thus allowing you to send your shell traffic in through a port that's accepted over a firewall or similar kind of network control without actually affecting any services that are already running legitimately on these ports. The final actual shell type is based on ICMP. So in this case, the shell traffic will be kind of sent back and forth in ICMP echo requests. Now, the traffic for this is actually quite distinctively marked. ICMP has an identification field, and in this case, it's always set to 1, 2, 3, 4. But for those of you who might want to detect this using something like Snort or Suricata, just be careful about endianness issues. I know that our detection engineers got a little bit tripped up by that previously. And now the final function, and this is, in my view, actually one of the most interesting, is what the threat actor called a monitor packet. This shows up when the password isn't actually recognized by BPF-DOR, and it will send back a UDP packet containing an ASCII 1 character to an arbitrary IP and port. Essentially, it just acts as a kind of presence check. You know, send it a magic ping, it will return a response to somewhere. Now, the fun thing about this is you can actually, if you're aware of it, you can use it to scan the internet for BPF-DOR infections and get good telemetry on kind of the victimology of this threat actor globally. However, unfortunately, it's largely been phased out now. So in an incident response in October 2021, we saw basically all of the samples did not support monitor packet. But to give you the obligatory world map, this all came from scans for that monitor packet functionality. And you can see that it's very heavily clustered around near neighbors to China. In particular, some of the kind of interesting victim spaces, they were very busy in Hong Kong and Macau, as well as Afghanistan, which is, I mean, if you look at some of the telecoms orgs in that area, they have so many different APTs active in that space. So that's not necessarily remarkable. So let's look a bit about some of the stuff we've seen them do more on the network. First off, BPF-DOR is not just used on the perimeter. It's also used to move laterally to kind of infected systems within the victim network as a way to access systems where some of the actually interesting data that we talked about previously can be found. So the way they'll do this is through some upstream infrastructure I'll describe in a moment. They will connect to a BPF-DOR installation on an internet-facing victim system. On this internet-facing victim, they'll drop a controller binary and use that, using the shell session they get through BPF-DOR, they will use that to gain access to these internal systems. And yeah, these internal systems are often where the actual kind of actions on objective take place. So what do these actions on objectives look like? In one instance, a bit like this. This is a command that Red mentioned executed on a box with some quite sensitive telecom subscriber information. You can essentially, they STP'd a file off of it to a short-lived Linode host. And one thing I've highlighted about this command is the fact that they set the user known hosts file option to /dev/null. What this will essentially do is prevent details on their exfil site being written to a known hosts file by the SSH client. And I've highlighted it just because I think it's a kind of nice ITsec touch that really speaks to their competence and knowledge in the Unix environment. Another command we saw several kind of permutations of is this, which is an invocation of a BPF-DOR controller binary. Essentially, this will instruct the controller to go out and tell this internal IP to connect back to the controller over port 80, and it will send the activation packet via ACMP, which is what the -i argument instructs. We've also seen deployment of a lot of different web shells, but a particularly interesting one is regeorge. The reason for this is not so much a standard web shell focused on executing commands, but it actually allows you to proxy traffic into the victim environment. Essentially, it will come with a client binary which will get you a SOX5 proxy into the victim space using only a web shell. So the way we look at, one of the things we saw from application logs on one of the systems they deployed regeorge to was that they used it to access hosts, which then later had BPF-DOR installed to them. So it potentially speaks to the ways that they move laterally within victim environments. I've been talking a lot about Linux, but Red mentioned also operates in Windows, particularly kind of in the early stages of an intrusion. So the primary implement we've seen them use is MangSML, which is a fairly old piece of malware that was released as open source on a Chinese forum in the mid-2000s. It's been associated with quite a few different threat actors over the years, but one of the interesting things we've seen is that they actually pack it with two different layers of packer, UPX and then something custom, which uses the same algorithm as is used to protect the config in MangSML. Now, once you actually unpack these two layers, if you have a few samples, you'll notice that every single sample is byte identical other than the config. So what this says to me is that they're probably actually using a builder in the back end which will edit these values in place, as opposed to, say, actively developing and working on this toolchain. Also, in all the samples we have, the C2s have been on this particular ASN, AS55933, which is a Hong Kong-based cloud provider called Cloudy. And with MangSML, we've also seen them drop, as I mentioned before, some custom and off-the-shelf network enumeration tools. These are kind of your usual stuff, so scanners and tools used to enumerate Windows users, groups, and so on. We've also seen them drop some extra Linux tooling, usually into the shared memory device. So one victim, who was a Central Asian telecoms provider, uploaded 3 files to VT within a couple of minutes of each other. The first of these is called S, which was a simple Python port scanner. It had some particular capabilities for NetBIOS and HTTP. Now, something interesting that I've noticed and that you can see in these screenshots here, just a little programming kind of habit. So this is decompiled code from BPF-DOR. The names come from dwarf symbols left in it by the threat actor. And you can see that it's taking the output of getPID and storing it in a variable called godPID. This is then later used for some of the locking and kind of single instance functionality. Next, what you see is that the Python script code, which comes from this S sample here, creates a lock and stores it in a variable called God. So what you have is this kind of common motif of the term God being used for locking, mutex, single instance type stuff, which indicates to me that the developers of these tools at least kind of speak the same language, if they're not the same. The next thing we've seen was a sample called V, which was an exploit for a struts2 vulnerability. You could find the original exploit on GitHub, but they'd made a few small modifications to it. One of the most interesting was that, so they modified the IP address in the usage instructions. In the legitimate version, it would be a local address, but in the red mention version, it actually pointed to an address associated with a Hong Kong university. Now, that's quite interesting because our BPF-DOR victim scans returned a Hong Kong university. So it potentially points to some kind of targeting interest that we couldn't otherwise verify. The final tool was a packed version of something called Print Spoofer. It's a Windows LPE tool that essentially, if you have, I think it's SE impersonate privilege, it'll escalate you to local system. So I mentioned we'd look upstream a little bit. In both our incident response data engagements and our network telemetry, we saw the same set of DigitalOcean VPSs used in multiple victims. When these were being used, we also saw SSH traffic coming from Taiwanese residential networks, particularly this AS3462, which is Chunghua HiNet, I believe. And we later identified something like 750 potential relays, of which 95% were this one network. Now, what you can see in this graph here is actually the overlap between traffic between these VPSs and victims and traffic between the relay network and the VPS. So in red, there's traffic from these Taiwanese residential networks to the VPS, and in gray, there's traffic from the VPS to the victims. So as you can see, there's a fairly clear kind of overlapping pattern. So the model we kind of get to is that something on a residential network is being used to SSH into these C2s, which are then being used to access VPF-DOR infections in actual victim networks. So the obvious question is, what actually is running on these residential IPs? Turns out most of them, I've referred to them as ORBs here, operational relay boxes, were routers made by a single manufacturer, Cepido. I had a quick look at some of the firmware used by this manufacturer, and there was a fairly straightforward remote code execution. Effectively, there was a path you can browse to with zero authentication that would give you a user interface that you can enter commands in, and they're executed as routes, which really isn't something you should have internet-facing, if you ask me. We also looked at kind of correlating it with other data, like from online port scanners, and we noticed that when these devices were used to SSH into Red Mention's VPSs, they also showed up with some VPN servers, usually using some quite old-school protocols like point-to-point tunneling protocol or L2TP. A little further digging into some documentation showed that these protocols are actually supported by the firmware of these routers. Now, one of the things that you encounter when you're running a large relay network in residential space is DHCP churn. Essentially, a single device won't actually stay on the same IP address for very long. They'll all be rotated fairly regularly. Red Mention used dynamic DNS to address this. So essentially, the devices would regularly check in with the DDNS provider to get the new IP, the domains resolving to the new IPs. And something I noticed is that domains had a particular style. So when I first encountered this network, they looked kind of like this. As you can see, that's very distinctively keyboard smashing rather than random text. For instance, ASD, GFH, all of these characters are on one single row of a QWERTY keyboard. And you can see similar patterns if you kind of look at some of the others. They're all fairly clustered together on a QWERTY device. But more recently, the domains they use seem to have become a bit more thematic. So you've got accounts, you've got who am I, a command on a lot of different systems. You've got NTP, a network protocol. Why they've changed like this, I don't know, but it's an interesting observation. So I mentioned on my first slide that part of how we attributed these guys was pattern of life analysis. We identified that they come out of UTC +8. So what I've got here is a heat map of essentially traffic coming from the Taiwanese IP addresses, these compromised routers, to Red Mention's VPSs. And so what do we see? Activity is mostly kind of Monday to Friday with a little bit of stuff going on Saturday. It always starts about 0100 UTC, ends about 10 UTC, and drops off for an hour at 4. So let's move that forward 8 hours into what's often called Beijing time. Activity starts around 9, drops off for an hour around 12, and ends around 6. I think some of you may well be kind of familiar with that pattern for some reason or another. Now, another thing that was quite interesting is to look at when they're not online. So, among other days that they weren't was October 1st, the People's Republic of China's National Day, and February 1st, or Lunar New Year. So this kind of pattern of life observations fairly strongly point towards attribution as a China-based threat actor. And just to address one more thing on Red Mention, kind of the public disclosure that happened in early May. So start of May, a researcher tweeted a hash of a controller binary used by Red Mention. But we've been tracking these guys for a fair bit longer. I mentioned that we started to encounter them in incident response engagements around mid-2021. And where we can, we've attempted to positively identify victims, pass them notification, and so on. You know, as and when we can identify a victim and reach them. But yeah, this public disclosure prompted a cascade of coverage on Red Mention. They were all over Twitter for a couple of days on various, and they got releases from a couple of vendors. So I'd particularly highlight the work of CrowdStrike and Elastic on them. They are well worth a read. But I wondered, would we see anything interesting happen from our telemetry? Would they, for instance, burn their VPSs? Would they try and grab data while they still had accesses? Long and short is no. The day after disclosure, they logged on to their VPS around 9:20 local time. They accessed a telecoms victim. They did scanning against a range associated with another potential target, and they logged off about 6:30 in the evening. In other words, if we refer back to here, business as usual. So this takes us through to our conclusions.
So I guess the key takeaway from all of this work is that, you know, this poses a huge challenge to our industry. We've just gone through 2 case studies there where the motivation is the same, the end goal is the same, and there's even overlap in the countries where these telecommunications providers are being compromised, and yet the methodology is completely different. So it's not just about knowing that the threat is coming, it's also how it's coming, and this is just 2 examples of it. So, you know, that's kind of like the bad news, but the positives are that our knowledge and understanding of the threat is always growing. And, you know, I think we're in a better place than ever to be tracking and mitigating these threats. And also, you know, threat actors make mistakes. They can be lazy, as we saw with some of the Red Dev 4 case study, you know, using the same domains for many years, reusing infrastructure, using default ports for things, overlapping metadata across different X509 certificates. So, you know, these are the things that I think we need to capitalize on and take advantage of. But as well, to add to that kind of human element, there is the fact that this is strategic targeting, and it's espionage motivated. So we can start to think about and explore the option to predict where the next compromises may be, where they may occur. So thank you very much for listening. We're happy to take any questions now, or feel free to grab us later on if that's easier. Thanks.
All right. Okay, no questions? Yes, there is a question.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for your presentation. This is more a question on the strategic level. With the 13th 5-year plan, which very much focused on Made in China 2025, there was a clear correlation of targets and the 5-year plan. Now we have the new 5-year plan, which is focusing on Chinese autarky. And do you actually expect, or what kind of correlation do you see between current activities and the new 5-year plan? So, sorry, strategic level question, not technical level.
So you're referring to the most recent 5-year plan. That's a good question, because it's something that we are thinking about as well, and it's something that, it's another reason why we kind of came up with this forecasting product. It was kind of the red therefore activity, but also thinking about how the 5-year plan may influence targeting shifts. And we definitely do see some overlap there. So I guess, for example, when it comes to things like targeting of intellectual property of certain sectors or industries that are kind of leaders in that field, so things like artificial intelligence, I guess, which was referenced in the most recent one. So yeah, I mean, we definitely do see it. I think it's something where we've kind of always kept track on, but are only recently kind of pushing out. So yeah, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah. We have definitely seen targeting in the past that kind of aligns to previous 5-year plans around things like semiconductor and sectors like that. So yeah, it's a good point and something well worth keeping track of.
Any other questions? Okay, doesn't seem so. So thank you, Will and Ben, for the nice presentation.